Did you know that in some states you can legally marry your first cousin, but you can't marry your adopted sibling even if you've never lived in the same house? Or that there are still states where a marriage can be declared invalid if the bride wasn't a virgin on her wedding night? These aren't relics from the 1800s that nobody enforces anymore. These are active laws the courts are still using to make decisions about marriages in 2045. I'm going to expose the most bizarre marriage laws that are still legally binding in America today. And some of these are going to shock you. If you're new to the channel, I reveal the most unbelievable truths about American law that most people never hear about. And I post new content every single day, so make sure you subscribe, because today's revelations are going to leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about marriage in America. Let's start with something that sounds like it came from a medieval law book, but is still enforced today. In Tennessee, you cannot marry your wife's grandmother. But here's the twisted part. You can marry your wife's granddaughter. The law specifically prohibits marriage to ancestors, but not descendants of your spouse. So if your wife has an 18-year-old granddaughter from a previous relationship, Tennessee law doesn't prevent you from divorcing your wife and marrying her granddaughter. But if your wife's 95-year-old grandmother becomes widowed, that marriage would be illegal and void. This law has actually been tested in court as recently as 2019, and the Tennessee Supreme Court upheld it. Now, let's talk about something even more bizarre. In Utah, you can legally marry your first cousin, but only if both of you are over 65 years old. The reasoning behind this law is that couples over 65 are unlikely to have children. So the genetic concerns about cousin marriage don't apply. But here's where it gets weird. If you're offering your cousin is 66, you have to wait a full year before you can legally marry. And if you lie about your age to get around this law, the marriage is automatically void and you can be charged with marriage fraud. Utah courts have actually annulled marriages where couples lied about their ages to marry their cousins. But that's not even the strangest cousin marriage law. In North Carolina, you can marry your first cousin, but only if you're both from different racial backgrounds. This law was created during the Jim Crow era as a way to discourage interracial relationships while still allowing some form of cousin marriage. The law has never been repealed, and it's still technically enforceable today. So in North Carolina, a white person can legally marry their black first cousin, but two white first cousins cannot legally marry each other. Legal scholars have called this one of the most racist marriage laws still on the books in America. Now, let's talk about something that affects thousands of marriages every year. In Massachusetts, your marriage is automatically void if either spouse was of unsound mind at the time of the ceremony. But here's the catch. Unsound mind includes being under the influence of alcohol. So if you had a few drinks before your wedding ceremony in Massachusetts, your marriage might not be legally valid. This law is still actively enforced, and Massachusetts courts have annulled marriages where couples admitted to drinking before the ceremony. The most famous case involved a couple who got married in 2021 after having champagne during their getting ready photos. The marriage was annulled 6 months later when they tried to divorce, and the court ruled they had never been legally married in the first place. But here's something even more shocking about Massachusetts marriage law. You cannot get married on a Sunday unless you obtain special permission from the state. This law dates back to Puritan blue laws, and while most blue laws have been repealed, this one remains in effect. Couples who want Sunday weddings in Massachusetts must file a special petition with the state at least 30 days in advance and pay an additional $200 fee. If you get married on a Sunday without this permission, your marriage is legally void. Now let's talk about Delaware, which has one of the strangest marriage waiting periods in the country. In Delaware, there's a 24-hour waiting period between getting your marriage license and getting married. But the waiting period doesn't apply if the bride is pregnant. So if you want to get married immediately in Delaware, you need a doctor's note confirming pregnancy. This has led to a bizarre situation where some couples fake pregnancy documents to avoid the waiting period. Delaware courts have prosecuted dozens of people for marriage license fraud related to fake pregnancy claims. Speaking of pregnancy, let's talk about Missouri's marriage laws. In Missouri, a pregnant minor can get married without parental consent, but only if the pregnancy is verified by a doctor. But here's the weird part. The law doesn't specify how pregnant she has to be. So technically, a 16-year-old who is one day pregnant can get married without her parents' permission, but a 17-year-old who isn't pregnant cannot. Missouri family courts have handled cases where teenagers got married based on positive pregnancy tests, only to discover later that the tests were false positives. These marriages remain legally valid even if the pregnancy that justified them never existed. Now, let's discuss something that sounds completely made up but is absolutely real. In South Carolina, it's illegal to marry someone who is mentally ill. But the law defines mental illness so broadly that it includes anyone who has ever been treated for depression. So if you've ever taken antidepressants or seen a therapist for depression, you technically cannot legally marry in South Carolina. This law is rarely enforced, but it's still on the books. And it could theoretically be used to annul marriages. The South Carolina legislature has repeatedly refused to repeal this law, despite pressure from mental health advocates. But South Carolina has an even weirder marriage law. You cannot marry someone who has been convicted of adultery. So if your future spouse was previously married and divorced for cheating, you cannot legally marry them in South Carolina. This law applies even if the adultery conviction happened decades ago and even if it happened in a different state. South Carolina is one of only 3 states that still criminalizes adultery. And it's the only state that uses adultery convictions to restrict future marriage. Now let's talk about something that affects military families. In Virginia, active duty military personnel can get married by proxy, meaning they don't have to be physically present for their own wedding ceremony. But here's the bizarre twist. The law only applies if the service member is deployed to a combat zone. So if you're stationed in Germany or Japan, you can't get married by proxy. But if you're deployed to Afghanistan or Iraq, you can have someone stand in for you at your own wedding. Virginia courts have had to determine what qualifies as a combat zone for marriage purposes, and the definitions change based on current military operations. This has led to situations where couples plan proxy weddings only to have them invalidated when the deployment location was reclassified as non-combat. Let's discuss Nevada, which you'd think would have the most liberal marriage laws given Las Vegas's reputation. But Nevada actually has some of the strictest marriage fraud laws in the country. In Nevada, getting married with the intent to divorce within 1 year is considered marriage fraud and is punishable by up to 4 years in prison. This law was created to prevent fake marriages for immigration purposes, but it's been used to prosecute couples who got married for other benefits. The most famous case involved a couple who got married for health insurance benefits and divorced 11 months later. They were both sentenced to 2 years in prison for marriage fraud. Nevada courts use social media posts, text messages, and witness testimony to prove intent to divorce, making it one of the few states where your private communications about marriage can be used as evidence against you. Now let's talk about something that affects older Americans. In Florida, if you're over 62 and getting remarried, you must wait 6 months after your divorce is finalized before you can marry again. But here's the weird part. This waiting period doesn't apply if you're marrying the same person you just divorced. So in Florida, you can divorce your spouse on Monday and remarry them on Tuesday, but you can't marry someone new for 6 months. This law has created a cottage industry of couples who get divorced and immediately remarried to reset their prenuptial agreements or change their estate planning. Florida family courts handle hundreds of these recycled marriages every year. But Florida has an even stranger marriage law that most people don't know about. You cannot get married during your lunch break. Florida law requires that marriage ceremonies take place during normal business hours, which are defined as 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. But the law also requires that both parties take the day off work to get married. So if you try to get married during your lunch hour, the marriage is technically invalid. This law is rarely enforced, but it's been used to annul marriages when couples later wanted to divorce and avoid property settlements. Now let's discuss something that sounds like science fiction but is actual law. In Montana, you can marry someone who is already dead, but only under very specific circumstances. The law allows posthumous marriage if the couple was engaged, lived together for at least 1 year, and one partner died within 30 days of the planned wedding. Montana is the only state that allows posthumous marriage, and it grants the surviving partner full inheritance rights as if they had been legally married. The most famous case involved a rancher who died in a car accident 2 weeks before his wedding. His fiancée was able to posthumously marry him and inherit his entire estate, despite objections from his family. Montana courts have handled over 200 posthumous marriages since the law was enacted in 1985. But here's something even more bizarre about Montana marriage law. You can legally marry your horse. Montana law defines marriage as a union between two beings, not specifically two humans. While no human-horse marriages have been legally recognized, the law doesn't explicitly prohibit them. Legal scholars have argued that this is an oversight in the law's language, but the Montana legislature has refused to clarify the definition. Let's talk about something that affects military families across the country. Federal law allows military personnel to have multiple marriages in different states without getting divorced, as long as each marriage serves a different military purpose. So a soldier could be married to one person for dependent benefits, married to another person for housing allowances, and married to a third person for deployment support. These marriages are all legally valid as long as they don't overlap geographically and serve different military functions. This law has created situations where service members have been legally married to up to 5 different people simultaneously. The Department of Defense has guidelines for managing multiple marriages, and military lawyers specialize in navigating these complex relationships. Now, let's discuss something that affects transgender Americans. In Texas, your marriage is automatically void if either spouse changes their legal gender after the wedding. So if you're married in Texas and your spouse transitions and legally changes their gender, your marriage is no longer valid. This law applies even if both spouses consent to the gender change and want to remain married. Texas courts have forced dozens of couples to divorce and remarry after gender transitions, even when the couples didn't want a divorce. This law is currently being challenged in federal court, but it remains in effect as of 2005. But Texas has an even stranger marriage law. You cannot marry someone who has the same first name as you. This law was created to prevent identity fraud, but it applies even when there's no fraud involved. So if your name is John Smith and you want to marry someone named John Jones, you cannot legally do so in Texas. One of you would have to legally change your name before the marriage could take place. Texas courts have forced hundreds of couples to change their names before allowing them to marry. Now let's talk about something that affects international couples. In New York, if you marry someone who is not a U.S. citizen, you must prove that you can support them financially for at least 10 years. But here's the bizarre part. This requirement applies even if your foreign spouse is independently wealthy. So if you want to marry a millionaire from another country, you still have to prove that you can support them financially. New York courts have denied marriage licenses to couples where the American spouse couldn't meet the income requirements, even when the foreign spouse had significantly more money. This law has prevented thousands of international marriages and has been criticized as discriminatory, but it remains in effect. Finally, let's discuss something that ties all of these weird laws together. The federal government recognizes all state marriages as long as they're valid in the state where they were performed. So all of these bizarre state marriage laws create nationally recognized marriages. A posthumous marriage in Montana is recognized by the IRS for tax purposes. A cousin marriage in Utah is recognized by Social Security for benefits. A proxy marriage in Virginia is recognized by the military for dependent benefits. This means that America has some of the most complex and contradictory marriage laws in the world, where something that's illegal in one state becomes a federally protected right in another. These aren't just historical curiosities or forgotten laws that nobody enforces. These are active legal statutes that courts use to make decisions about people's lives every single day. If this video opened your eyes to just how strange American marriage law really is, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. We dive deep into the most shocking legal truths every single day, and tomorrow's video is going to expose the legal loopholes that let some people legally disappear and change their identities. You won't believe what's actually possible under American law. Thanks for watching, and remember, the law is often stranger than fiction, especially when it comes to something as supposedly simple as getting married.